What's up, Team Tobias? What's up, Marshalltown, Ohio? Lane Hama here from the Tobias Literary Lens with Ann Rose and Jackie Lipton. Today, we're going to be talking about character development. Ann, when did you figure out how to develop your character?
When did I develop my one character that I've developed? That's
your
it, right?
Characteristics. Yeah, tell us about you.
Okay, so I think we should rewind here and talk about like what brought on this topic. And so right before Lane pressed record on this video here, I asked, has anyone watched Queen Charlotte on the Netflix, Bridgerton's Queen Charlotte? And the answer was a resounding no. And I don't understand. But I think Queen Charlotte is actually a really great character study because it really is like we get to see the backstory of this woman who's almost in some ways she's kind of villainized in like the Bridgerton shows, right? But you get to see like her past and like how like why she is the way she is and like this love that she has with and it's lost me. And I'm back. Am I back? I'm back.
You're
here.
Back.
Can you see me? I'm kind of back. It's just my internet is terrible. What are you going to do? And now I can't hear Lane. Nope.
Oh,
I was muted.
Oh.
Good job.
We're
doing well.
We're doing amazing today. So, anyway, that's how the conversation started. So who out there, leave a comment. Have you watched Queen Charlotte? Because I need someone to talk to about this. I need to have a conversation with someone who has seen Queen Charlotte on Netflix.
I will get there. I'm just behind.
That's fair.
Does Queen Charlotte get murdered?
No. I was kind of 50-50 on if I was going to watch it, and then I just put it on, and I was really fascinated by it. I think I like those kind of like character studies, and I'm sure Lane has seen Suicide Squad.
Yes.
Okay. I think that movie I don't think it's a really great movie. However, I do think it's a great character study, right?
Which one? The first one or the second one?
The first one, where you get to like.
I've only seen the first one.
I've only seen the first one, where you meet like each of the players and like you get their backstory and like why they are who they are, how they got there. Like those are really great studies of the characters.
Tell us about one.
I mean, it's been a minute since I've watched it, and I think I don't know, like Harley Quinn, obviously, that's one that comes to mind. Like her, like. I don't obviously love that it's because of a man. Let's just put that out there right away. However, it does show like how she started out, how she was this brilliant scientist and how like this love for this person like kind of made her kind of go bananas. And so I find all those little kind of like things interesting. So little backstories, like that's how you figure out like who your character is, right? You understand where they come from, what kind of incidents that brought them to the present, and it informs who they are on the page for your current story. We don't always necessarily need to see all the things that happened in the past, but I think that it's interesting when we do think about them and then how it gets us to where we are, right?
And I think it's a much more subtle balance than people realize. And I'm always rediscovering this as an agent and as a reader, that it sounds so simple because like everyone thinks about, Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and he's from these humble beginnings and he gets all this great power, and then he learns that with great power comes great responsibility. And that's such a paradigm easy character study. But when you look at introducing a character for the first time in a novel, you obviously don't want to overwhelm the reader with the entire backstory of this character. But if you don't do any of it, or if you don't, thank you, Lane, or if you don't do enough of it, then it kind of feels like the tree without the root system. It sort of feels like, why do we care about this person? Because we kind of see what they're doing externally, but we don't know internally what's motivating them. And as I've commented on more and more client manuscripts lately, I'm just realizing how subtle and challenging it is to get that balance of background and motivation right. It's really hard.
It really is. And I think a lot of times we end up, writers will even tell you, like, they find that they are more interested in their villain than they are in their main character because they've really considered what their villain's backstory is, right? Because we don't want those like just mustache twirling bad guys, that monologue at the end, right? You want them to feel fully fleshed out. And so there's a lot of time that you think about, and as a writer myself, we think about like, where did they come from? Why do they think that they are right? And so you do all of that, but you don't always necessarily remember to do that for your main character. And it seems like you should, but sometimes you just kind of forget.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think often it's because our protagonists often have a little more in common with us as the person creating them, particularly with early writers. And then it's like you take it as read that there's this whole backstory because you relate to the protagonist that you've created. But it's like, well, they're not you. So you can't give them your backstory. But if you're drawing from you or people you know, then how much is too much and how much is not enough? And how do you do it without it being exposition? Like how do you show the background of the character without going into an internal monologue and going, well, I never really did live up to my dad's expectations. Like that's not interesting either.
No. I kind of like have the example that I use sometimes. It's like, if you have a character who has been in a horrific car accident, right? You wouldn't see them necessarily jump into a car and then decide to go racing, right?
Yeah.
So you just have to think about where they were before and how they would react into their current situation. So if you want a character that's going to go drag racing, for example, then, where have they done it before? What is their situation? Do they have any experiences with, like, all of those things feed into the current moment. So obviously it's more interesting if you have a character who is now afraid of racing a car and now they have to and they're forced into it. So finding ways to like counterbalance some of those things can make more interesting and complex characters overall.
Yeah, that actually makes me think of Downton Abbey. And is it Lady Mary or whoever it was whose husband dies in the car crash and then her next romantic interest is a car race driver? And it's just a nice way of setting it up because, in one season, the audience lived through that trauma. So she carries it with her. And then, of course, the next person she is attracted to happens to have it as his life's goal, the one thing that she's scared to death of. And you can do that. Well, you can do it in TV very quickly because you just show a scene quite quickly. But in a book, it's harder.
Yeah, but you could show the hesitation, right? And then it begs the question. And so now you've essentially put a question on the page that the reader wants to know the answer to. Well, why can't they? And so that's something you can feed into the story later. You don't have to address it at the moment. But, begging those small questions help hook the reader in and anchor them into the story and make them want to turn the page to find it out. Are we boring you, Lane? Are we boring you?
Get some coffee. You obviously
not at all. Not at all. I'm listening with bated breath, so much that I had to cover my mouth to make sure it didn't expel fire.
Just didn't explode all over the screen. So what are your thoughts about character development, Lane? You've been very quiet.
I've been thinking, I'm going to think about it in movie terms because I think it helps translate to book terms. So I've read a number of interviews with actors who say even though none of it has made it on screen, they will write 5 to 10 page backgrounds on their characters and events that they've been through and tragic events like you said about the car crash. And I know from playing D&D, I sort of did that myself. I had a formula of creating a background for all the NPC characters. And as part of that, I would make sure they had 2 positive and 2 negative traits. And in each scene, they had to portray at least 1 positive and 1 negative trait. So it did create that kind of gray, morally, unsure character that we all really are, because none of us are all good or all bad, except for Anne, obviously. So that's where my head is at.
No, you bring up a good point, because not everyone is perfect, right? And so you have to have that balance of, we read books for conflict. That's really what it comes down to. So if everything is all joyful and happy and beautiful and wonderful, like all the way through, then it's like, well, but what's the, why do I read?
And everyone always cites Walter White from Breaking Bad. I almost said Baking Bad. That's funny.
That could be
because he's a horrible person, out murdering everyone, all that jazz. But we love him. Great character. There's somewhere that I read, you don't have to like the character, but you do have to sympathize with them.
Ooh, which brings us to the topic of unlikable characters.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. So I think you bring up a good point, because I love a good unlikable character, right? Like I love a good morally great character, one you're like, I'm not so sure, but you're right. And that, writers out there, for you listening, you just need what we call in the industry, obviously, a save the cat moment. So you got to give them a reason to sympathize or be able to be like, okay, well, they're not the greatest person, but they did this thing and it's kind of cool. So I think I can get behind that.
And actually, I have to say, this whole discussion from Breaking Bad onwards is reminding me of the movie Galaxy Quest, where all of the characters, it's meta in the sense that all of the characters have something they have to overcome from that stupid TV show that they did, but they learn so much more in the process. So like Tim Allen's character is not remotely a likable character. I mean, he's Tim Allen, so, he's cute and whatever in the way he presents his lines, but there is something about him that, and then in the end, he does learn it's for the good of the many, and if you can fix one mistake, and if you've wronged one person, and I keep thinking of Alan Rickman saying, that's your problem, you were never serious about the craft. And it's like, that's all about characterization, isn't it? Like, what is the rock monster's motivation? It's a rock monster, it doesn't have motivation, but the humans all do, and they're all struggling with what their motivation is. So I find that actually a really good way of dealing with the emotional baggage, and we immediately like even the unlikable characters in that cast because they did something cute that we could relate to. They're on a 60s sci-fi show and there are conventions and they have fans and we can relate to it. Are they all nice? And no, but I'm engaged enough.
Grabthar's hammer, you shall
and they
be
say that a lot. Yeah.
And it's interesting because they say, in order to sympathize or empathize with a character, make them suffer, And I know in film, it's usually, if we want to make someone likable, start out with them helping a kid or an animal.
Save the cat.
Yes. And then we're always like, oh, save the cat. I love him. He saved the cat. It reminds me in that episode of The Sopranos where the villain, the bad guy, kills a horse and Tony Soprano kills him for killing the horse. And I mean, he murdered someone, but it's in defense of this poor innocent horse. So you're like, oh, that's good for him.
Go ahead.
Okay, this is really, and Lane may want to cut this bit because I don't think the person is going to be identifiable from what I'm about to say, but at a law conference on a publishing law panel, I was with another lawyer who refers to that book in that moment as "Don't kick the cat," not "Save the cat," but "Don't kick the cat." And I said, no, that's not what it's called. It's called, and I went on to try and explain why it's save the cat, why you affirmatively have to do something positive rather than refraining from doing something negative that you could do. But I'm thinking if a smart law professor can read that book and come away thinking it's called Don't Kick the Cat, it's a point that bears repeating, that it's not about they don't do stuff that's as bad as they could do. It's about they do something that is affirmatively relatable. And that, it sounds like the same thing if you're not thinking about it, but it's a very different narrative thing.
Right. And with the new release of, or coming up of the new Hunger Games book, we can talk about Hunger Games, right? So
Yes.
the first chapter in the Hunger Games, right? We're not going to mention the fact that it starts with character waking up. We're just not going to do it because it's terrible. It's a terrible way to start. Just don't do it.
There is a literal cat.
That's it. She saved the cat. That is the save the cat moment in that book, is that Katniss saved the cat for her sister. And now she's going to go out hunting and she's trying to save her family, right? So she has her literal save the cat moment is that she saved this cat that's hissing at her and hates her because she loves her sister. She did this thing and now she has to feed it even though they're all starving because she loves her sister.
And that's so much more effective than her coming onto the page and saying how much she loves her sister and her sister's all she has left in the world.
Right. And it has no benefit to herself either.
Yeah.
So that's another.
It's a detriment to her because she has to hunt more. Yeah.
That's character development. You don't need to. It's funny because in films, it's what the characters say. But in books, it's what the characters do that I think tells us what they're about.
Right, because we do in books, it's more show, don't tell, right? And in movies, you only have a tell because it's all dialogue, more or less, with the visuals.
Yeah.
And actually, I guess that was a question I was mentioning before we got on that I occasionally teach adult ed writing classes. I've been doing it forever, well before I was an agent. But a question came up recently about what the student called cinematographic point of view and really is third person omniscient. It's when an author does that sort of sweeping thing with the camera lens where they describe, and I've talked about things like starting with a weather report and spending too much time on the setting, which happen to be personal dislikes of mine. But that does have its uses. I mean, there's clearly a lot of craft discussion that overlaps between the visual arts, film, TV on the one hand, and books on the other. And there are uses for that in books, but you have to really think about why and when you take like a cinematic approach, which, comes from cinema and happens to be more useful often in that context, versus something smaller and more discreet like the cat in Hunger Games. That's a really small, discreet thing, but it gives the reader so much information by not giving them a lot of information, by not showing you the whole of all of the districts and how hard it is in District 12 and this and that and the other. It just shows this small moment of the beginning of the day of the reaping and what our protagonist is doing with this cat.
Right. And another good point that you bring is that, yes, that there's this event that is happening later, but you don't know what that is. You don't know what it means, right? Like and we don't get into it until later. So you just know that she has to go hunting to feed her family. It's a big deal. There's this event coming on later. And then the author raises the stakes, right? Katniss has to sneak through the fence. And if she's caught, then, all goes to hell, right? So slowly raising the stakes while you're trying to see, is she going to be able to complete this task? Is she not? She goes to the market. I mean, by the time you get to the reaping, we're like 50 pages in before anything really, before the real inciting incident takes place. So it's just a really well-crafted beginning and anchoring you in to the forward thrust of the book by great character development.
Which also brings us to one of my favorite questions, to which I never know the answer, and it's different for every project. But how much confusion is good confusion? So that thing of at the very end of chapter 1, I think the last line of chapter 1 is "Today is the day of the reaping." Yes, we all memorized the book before this podcast, but we don't find out what the reaping is until later. And I think that's another thing that we all struggle with. And I think every author at some point struggles with this. How much confusion is good confusion? Like, when do you have to disclose what things actually are? Because obviously, if you dump everything on the reader at the beginning, that's just really boring and you don't have a story. But if you have too many unanswered questions, like what's District 12? What's the reaping? Why do they have stupid names? And why don't they have any, like all of this stuff? Then it's like, okay, now I'm just completely confused and I'm going to go and watch TV because I don't understand what's happening. That I find really hard. And because plot and character are very much two sides of the same coin, you know, how do you know how many questions you can leave hanging to interest the reader without just completely confusing them? Anne, why don't you tell us the answer to that question?
Well, I think you're right, because I think it's going to vary by project and by story. And there's so many other things involved in that, that you can't, there is no one size fits all. And I think that's for all writing advice, right? Like there's never one size fits all for any book, any project, anything. So I think this is where your beta readers and your critique partners and your fresh eyes, people who have never seen the book before, really come into play. So if you are struggling with like how much information to give, you get a pair of fresh eyes on your first chapter, your first 2 chapters, and you say, you know, is this working for you? Does this make you want to read more? And you kind of go from there. So, but it's a great question, and
Well,
one
I've
that
been
does not have a good answer.
yeah, no, I've been thinking about it a lot in the context, because I work a lot on mysteries, like murder mysteries, which I love. It's one of my favorite genres to read. I rep a lot of mystery authors. And, you know, in your traditional, like Agatha Christie, closed room, whatever, someone dies. And the question is, who did it? And that's the question. That is the question of the book. It's very simple. But I think in today's mystery genre, there's a little more than that, because we're so inured to this idea of, oh, it's a mystery, someone's going to die, you know, blah, blah, blah. So like, why do we care about this particular murder? Why do we care about this particular detective? So I get a lot of submissions in my inbox in the mystery genre, which just start with a dead person. They start with the police discovering a dead body. And unfortunately, that's not really all that interesting in terms of debut authors now, just because we're kind of past that at the moment. We want more questions, more interesting questions, I think, than, well, who was the victim and who was the murderer? I know Lane does horror and thrillers a lot, which may have some similarities, that you're trying to do something new and different. But I think it's something for writers to think about, that even if you're in a genre like romance or mystery or whatever it is, don't go for the obvious questions. Try and kind of subvert them in some way, engage the reader, not by just saying, this is someone with a broken heart or here's a dead body, but like, why do we care about this person with the broken heart? Why do we care about this victim or this detective or whatever?
One of the best thrillers I've ever read started with the grenade being tossed into a room and rolling along the floor, and the of it rolling, and then tick, 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 boom.
That's very cinematic. That's a very cinematic opening.
Yes, it was pretty cool.
Yeah.
So,
Anne, final thoughts?
Final thoughts. So, if you are looking to do or read about character development, I'm going to pitch my own book. The Seemingly Impossible Love Life of Amanda Dean, which is right there, is you get Amanda's story. So that is how I personally subverted the romance genre in a way, because you do not know who she ends up with at the end of the book until you get there. So it was fun to write. It was fun to learn about Mandy and like how she became like on this journey to her finding her forever love. So I'm gonna say that real quickly, and also I'm gonna say that really do think about when you're writing your characters. Really think about like where they came from, what experiences they had, and how that can inform what they're doing on the page.
Yeah, I think I'm going to endorse both things Anne said. I've read the manuscript, so you should definitely read The Seemingly Impossible Love Life of Amanda Dean, because it is a immaculate study in character development and the plot. I asked Anne about this. I said, how on earth did you do that? And she had lots of Post-it notes. So there you go. But also that sort of, that, is it Hemingway, that 9/10 of the iceberg thing, that you need to know, like the book might be that like 1/10 of the iceberg above the water, but you need to know the 9/10 of the iceberg about all your characters, which is why you are going to probably put a lot more work into figuring out their backstory and their likes and their dislikes and their fears. The reader will never see that, but the reader will see the result of it, which should be an engaging character.
I'm going to co-sign what they said, because I also read Anne's book, and it is also incredibly funny, and it was a fantastic book. Anne, how about you take us out?
All right. So thank you for joining us today on The Literary Lens with Lane Haymont and Jackie Lipton and me, Anne Rose. And make sure you like, subscribe, and leave us a comment in the chat. I really am interested in those of you who have watched Queen Charlotte and like what your thoughts were. I'd love to have a dialogue with you about it, because I don't know. I really kind of enjoyed watching the episodes and seeing the progression, and like, just watch it. And if you haven't watched it, watch it, and you should, and then talk to me about it, because I want to talk to someone about it. And
I'm going to interrupt too and say, before we have the formal sign off, we did not advertise our AMA.
I was just about to hop in and do that.
Go for
Excellent.
it.
Friday, June 21st. Friday, June 21st, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're having our AMA. We will post the link. Come, join, laugh. We're a fun bunch, I like to think. And we'll see you next time.